Hello and welcome to this week's Sunday Sitdown chat. I've played a few games recently that have a certain aspect to them, and I thought I'd discuss it in detail in today's channel, mostly from a game design perspective, also from a gamer's perspective. This is not a top 10 list. These are not necessarily my favorite games or games that I like, although I think most of the games I'm mentioning here are games that I do enjoy. So the mechanism I want to talk about today, or the aspect about games, are games that allow players to take multiple actions on their turn. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm not going to talk about games where I guess there's a whole series of games that aren't broken down into turns. I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about games where you have a specific turn, you have a distinct turn, and where you get to take multiple actions on that turn instead of just one action. An example of a one-action game would be, say, my game Viticulture. In Viticulture, on your turn, you place one worker, you take the action, and that's your turn. It moves on to the next player. And the reason why I gravitate towards this in my designs is that it keeps things flowing at a really nice pace. You're constantly moving forward. You're doing one quick thing. There's a little downtime between players. It allows many of my games to play up to 6 players because of the minimal downtime. And also, I think when there's only one thing you can do on your turn, it gives players a really interesting choice because you're having to balance, you're having to figure out what the most important thing to do right now is, especially if that thing or your other choices can be impacted by other players. If other players can do something else, you're trying to figure out, okay, do I do this thing now that I really want to do, or do I do this other thing that I really need to do, even though I think other players aren't all that interested in it? Anyway, that's games where you just do one thing on your turn. This video is about all the other games where you can take multiple actions on your turn, and the impact this has on the game and on the players, and what I think about that mechanism. And the reasons come to mind recently really are several games. One being a game that I played for the first time yesterday, Brass Birmingham. I played the original Brass once, but I've only played Brass Birmingham yesterday. And they both have a similar mechanism in that on your turn, except for your very first turn, on most turns in the game, you are taking 2 actions. On each action, you're choosing a card from your hand, and you are using that card or just discarding that card to take an action. And then you're doing another action. And in Brass, I actually think this works really well. I'll talk about some of the downsides of multiple actions in games in a moment. But I think in Brass, this works quite well because, on your turn in Brass, if you have analysis paralysis, you can take a while. And especially since some of the actions that you might have been thinking about taking can be impacted by the player right before you. But the difference between taking 1 action on your turn and 2 actions actually isn't all that much. So there's more of a gap between taking 0 actions and 1 action versus 1 and 2. So adding that second action doesn't actually add that much time. The biggest reason I think it's crucial in Brass is that you can have, if you can only take 1 action, you can have some pretty unsatisfying turns, both in terms of what you've done. So for example, if you take your turn and all you do is take a loan, then on your turn, even though you end up with a lot of money, because you don't get to spend that money right away, it feels like you didn't really do anything on your turn. And because when you take a loan, you actually go back on the victory point track or on the income track, it can almost feel like you took a loss on your turn. And so I really like that you can combo something like that with a more satisfying action on your turn. Also in Brass, there's an urgency to a lot of different things on the board. You're competing over a lot of different limited resources and spaces and just things that are very limited spatially on the board. And so by giving players 2 actions back to back, I think it increases the satisfaction that you can get from your turn where you're doing more than one thing. A specific example here is that on my turn, if I place a canal because I want to have access to a new city, if I could only take 1 action, I might place that canal, but then another player might gain access to that city before I do, which is fine. That can happen in games, that someone can jump in and do the thing that you were hoping. But I really do like the ability in Brass Birmingham to pair together 2 associated things that you really want, that you're very satisfied when they happen. So I think that's one aspect of multi-action turn games that where it's worth having multiple actions instead of just one. Where when many times two actions can play off of each other, and you might end up with a very unsatisfying turn or an unsatisfying set of turns if you don't have the ability to take multiple actions on your turn. So that's Brass Birmingham. Let me jump to, just because this box is kind of awkward to pick up. This is the Scythe Legendary box. So in Scythe, almost always, well, not almost always, often you take one action on your turn. You take usually a top row action. But what I've done in Scythe and a couple of my games, despite them being one action games, I often give players the ability to be rewarded with a second action. And inside the second action is a bottom row action. So if you have planned ahead and you have the resources to afford a bottom row action, you can not only take a top row action, but you could then take a bottom row action. You could also just jump to the bottom row action. You don't have to take a top row action. But obviously I liked it. I designed it, but it feels very rewarding to have planned ahead just a little bit enough to have the resources to afford a bottom row action, because it feels like on your turn, instead of just taking one action, suddenly you've done something that benefits, that rewards yourself with an extra action. And that to me, I think, is very satisfying. I think it works inside because the top row actions, as simple as they are and as inexpensive as many of them are, they're still satisfying to take on their own. If you're only doing a top row action, if you're only moving, if you're only trading, if you're only harvesting, producing, it is still very satisfying just to do that. But then it really does feel good if you get that pairing, if you're also able to take the bottom row action. So I think I like that aspect of game. I think I like this aspect of multi-action games where the standard is one action, but if you have done something to unlock or open or give yourself access to another action, then it can feel good. Now, let me contradict this a bit, because one thing in games that I rarely enjoy are bonus actions. So this is where you take a primary action, and then sometime on your turn, you also get to take an ancillary bonus action. And one of the main reasons I don't like this is that usually it's just like a long list of bonus actions that you can take, and you're looking through this list and trying to figure it out, which can take me away from the game space. But also because when you have bonus actions, it can be tough for the next player to know when you've actually finished your turn. There are so many times I've played bonus action games where I take my main action and then the other players, and maybe I'm not going to take my bonus action, and the other player is just sitting there waiting because maybe I haven't given them a clear indicator, but more importantly, the game hasn't given them a clear indicator that my turn is over. I think that's the game's responsibility to not rely necessarily on players to say, okay, your turn, your turn, your turn. That there's a clear indicator, like the worker that I've placed or the action that I've taken on my player mat, that shows that you've actually taken your turn. So bonus actions can muddy those waters when you have them. So for that and other reasons, I won't go into too many details here. I really do stay away from bonus actions in terms of creating multiple actions on your turn or giving players that ability to take multiple actions on their turn. What else? Let's do another game in my pile here. So this was another game that actually brought up this topic originally when I played Western Legends a few weeks ago. Western Legends is an open world sandbox game, and I haven't done a video about it yet, but I will talk about how much I enjoyed those open world aspects. Like I wanted to play poker a lot in the game, so I went and I played poker, and that was something I could do. The game didn't impede me from doing that. But Western Legends is a game where you can take, where almost always you do take multiple actions on your turn. I believe it's 2 actions. And there might even be a bonus action in there too. And I don't know, well, I know why they did it. I don't know if it was the best design choice. But I understand why they did it, which is that oftentimes in Western Legends, you are moving on your turn and then taking another action. But what ends up happening is you don't have to do that. I could just go to like the the gambling parlor, wherever you gamble in the game, and I could have just played poker twice on my turn. And poker takes a little while, or combat can take a little while. And so I think these multiple actions can work. I think it would have worked if the game had said, okay, on your turn, before or after your main action, you can move. You can move one time or move whatever your range is. You can do that one time. And that way it limits a very clean action, a very simple action, the move, with what could be an action that takes a little bit more time, whatever the more substantial action is. And I appreciate the freedom the game gives you to do multiple more substantial actions, but there were definitely times in the game where, and we were playing, I think, a 5 or 6 player game, where there was a substantial amount of time between turns, and where there wasn't always engagement between players on turns. So I think this is something really important to keep in mind in games where you have multiple actions, where there can be a little bit of downtime. I think it's almost necessary to keep the other players engaged. And Western Legends, to give it credit, actually does a really good job of this. There are many things that provide interactions between players on turns. Like the poker example I gave, if you are taking your turn and you play poker, and I happen to be in the same town as you when you play poker, I can play poker with you. So I think the game definitely did keep that in mind. The designer kept that in mind when designing Western Legends. But I think it's important for us designers to keep in mind that if you have a game that gives players the ability to take multiple actions on their turn, especially in a game that goes up to 5 or 6 players, I think it's crucially important to have many of those actions create engagement between the players in the game, so that they're engaged when it's not their turn. So the other game that made this come to mind, on the same day that I played Western Legends for the first time, I also played Root for the first time. I've played it twice now. And in Root, turns are long and elaborate. And we got into, by the second game we played, we got into a pretty good rhythm where we could take turns pretty quickly. But there is a lot going on your turn. You can often take multiple actions. You can do many things. In fact, with the Eerie, the birds, you could take almost a dozen actions on your turn. Like, you can take a lot of actions. And in some ways, I think this doesn't work. Well, I'll say this. For the asymmetry of the game, I think it is crucially important to the game that you do all of your things on one turn, that you follow these steps one by one. The game guides you really, really well to go through this asymmetry, because what you're doing is very different from the other players. I don't think it would work as well if I'm taking little bite-sized actions from turn to turn, and I think it would have taken away a lot of the design space for the asymmetry. It does contribute to downtime, but I think it works in Root for 2 reasons. One is that other players are often engaged in your turn, because there is, like, the whole game is interacting with other players on the board. I think it works for that reason. I think it also works because in Root, the decision space is so elaborate and complex. I actually find it really helpful to have some downtime, to be able to plan and think about my next turn and think through all my options and look through all my options. So that actually works quite well in Root in particular. So again, I think multiple turn actions or multiple action turns can work if you do have interactions with other players, or the other players are engaged in some way, or if I need time to plan on my turn and I don't actually mind the downtime that it takes for you to go through your actions. What next? Okay, here's another one that I actually have. Deck builders. Deck builders, a core part of deck builders is that you take multiple actions on your turn, except for Dominion. In Dominion, you do multiple actions on your turn, but you can only buy once. It's ABC, right? You can take one action, you can take one buy, and then whatever the last one is. I don't know what the last one is. It's been a while since I played Dominion. But in many deck builders, you can take multiple actions on your turn. You're basically playing out all of the cards in your hand. Many times you're combining them to buy something, but you can take multiple actions on your turn. And I think this works for deck builders, at least the ones that I've played, because the actions are so simple, because you are able to combine cards to buy something or to do something, to fight something. And because I don't think the turns would be satisfying if you were just taking one action on your turn. I think Dominion is somewhat the exception to this, because even though you're only taking one action, you can also take a buy, so you're still doing 2 different things. But yeah, I think that's a good thing for me to remember. when I think about multiple action games, that sometimes you can have such simple turns in a game that it's just not satisfying, especially if you have to then go around the table to 4 or 5 other players where you're waiting for them to do their things. Even if it's fast, I still want to do something satisfying on my turn. I'm out of games in my pile to talk about. Let's see. Oh, Terraforming Mars, I think, is a really good example of this. Because on Terraforming Mars, you have the decision to take 1 or 2 actions on your turn. And it is not a decision to be taken lightly. Because often in Terraforming Mars, you are waiting for a key moment to do something. Whether it's related to other players or whether it's related to one of the tracks in the game. Like you might have a card that can only be played at a certain time. There's also... there are times in Terraforming Mars where you're kind of hoping that the other players have passed because you want to do something without having to worry about those other players. And so in Terraforming Mars, you might slow play. You might only take 1 action per turn for several turns. But also at times I like the option to take 2 actions because sometimes you might really need to do 2 things back to back before another player does something, or because there's no reason to wait for other players. So I really like that choice in Terraforming Mars. It's somewhat akin to Scythe, where you're doing 1 or 2 things. But it is really a crucial choice in Terraforming Mars to maybe take those multiple actions. I like that. Orleans. Okay, I wanted to bring up Orleans briefly because Orleans does, like, you're taking many actions on your... Actually, no, not necessarily. I was thinking of Orleans as a multiple action turn, but really you are programming multiple actions simultaneously. But you are taking turns one at a time. So as soon as you set the board, you're actually just taking the actions one at a time. So I'll take that back. I'm not going to do Orleans. What else here? I just played Forbidden Sky yesterday. Forbidden Sky uses an action point allowance system where you get 4 actions on your turn, and you can use those actions however you want among an action menu. A lot of cooperative games end up in this category. You all probably know how I feel about action menus in games, but again, this is a situation where I think if you were only taking 1 action on your turn, it wouldn't be very satisfying, especially since the game has the game is constantly kind of beating down on you. At the end of your turn, you draw a card that says like lightning strikes or the wind blows, things like that. Something bad happens. So I think the alternate for this design would be for each player to just take 1 action and to have that bad thing happen every round instead of after every turn. I actually think that could be viable. I'm sure Matt Leacock tested that at some point and decided it didn't work, probably due to players sometimes taking turns that just aren't substantial and aren't satisfying. The nice thing in a cooperative game is that even though you're doing multiple things on your turn, it creates discussion among players about what those things should do. So other players are often engaged, whether it's through the mechanisms, the abilities that you have, or through just strategic discussion and tactical discussion. What else? I'm looking at my list here. I mentioned the need to have a clear end to your turn, even though you're taking multiple actions. The ability to pair together combos and create combos on your turn. Other players being engaged. Okay, I guess I'll end on a game that I'm working on, the open world exploration game I'm working on. I did run into the feeling in the game that if players could only do 1 thing on their turn, that it just wasn't substantial and satisfying enough. So I do have currently an action point system in the game. It doesn't use an action menu, but it does use action points where I won't go into too many details because it may change. But the point is, I am thinking about this. One of the reasons it's on my mind is that I'm thinking about this in a game that I have where it didn't feel like your turn was substantial enough. And I wanted to give players a little bit more flexibility to do more than 1 thing on their turn. And I am using an action, something adjacent to an action point system for that. Yeah, I know that's very vague. That doesn't really help this conversation at all. But it is something that's on my mind because I am working on a game with that. I'm very interested in your thoughts on this. There are a ton of games that allow players to take multiple actions on their turn that I did not mention here. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about instances where you think it works, where you think it adds to the game, where it makes you more satisfied to be able to have multiple actions on your turn, And maybe games where it doesn't work, where it really adds to the downtime, where it makes the end of the turn convoluted. It's hard to tell when your turn is actually over, or when it just makes turns really long and drawn out when it doesn't, when it could be broken down into much quicker actions. I'm interested in both. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. That's my Sunday sit down. Next week I'll be back. I think I'm going to do a top 10 components in games that I own. So if you're interested in that topic, let me know and I will consider that for next week. But I do have a bunch of other topics that I might delve into. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.